Okay.
Okay, for Monday. Monday is going to be exam 2, and all y'all have is basically chapter 5, chapter 11, and I'm still working on belief quiz results. I may give y'all those on Friday, so we're not going to deal with those today, but they may be coming. Now, I've got chapter 5 pulled up here, and understand on this. The first exam really dealt with an awful lot of articles, and then there were a fair amount of terms. This one, there's not going to be quite as many articles, depending upon what we cover on Friday, but there are a lot of links, and there are going to be more terms on this. So kind of keep that thought in mind. Links, don't forget about the links, whether it's the sex offender stuff from today, whether it's the links that we're dealing with political correctness from chapter 5, whether it was the difference between Congress or the voting rights tests. Make sure that you're comfortable with these things as we go forward. But why don't we just go ahead and start with some terms up here. Is there anything that jumps out as we jump in to chapter 5? Go ahead.
The invidious discrimination.
Yeah, what was invidious discrimination? Do y'all remember that?
Isn't that like where like you can't say I don't want to hire someone because they're blonde or because they have blue eyes?
Yeah, invidious discrimination. I think when I had gone over this, I had mentioned to y'all that discrimination is not prohibited in the United States Constitution. There are times when it's perfectly legal to discriminate. And I think I had mentioned to you, the example that stuck out to me was when I was a little kid and I would go to the amusement park and there would be those little cartoon stands, cartoon characters that would say, you have to be this tall to ride this ride. I guess it had to do with safety. If you were shorter, maybe, or smaller, maybe you would get thrown out and killed in a roller coaster. Of course, they don't want that. Is that discrimination? Well, yeah, it is. But is there a reason why? Well, yeah, there is. At 16, you can drive, but not at 15. Or at 18, you could vote, but not at 17. Or at 21, you could drink, but not at 20. These are all examples of invidious discrimination. Now, to be fair, I don't know all of the reasons why this would be. I don't understand necessarily the psychology or whatnot, but they have reasons based upon this. But if you said, okay, I'm not going to hire somebody because he or she has got long blonde hair or eye color or something that is irrational, well then at that point that's not going to be legal. So invidious discrimination is, yeah, you get the idea. Go ahead.
I read about once there was a case where a man sued Hooters because they refused to hire him because he was a man as a waiter.
That may be. I don't want to get into that today since this is just the review session. So let's make sure, because I can't test you on that, but that might be something that we get back to, not to be weird.
Okay.
What other questions have y'all got? Anything jumping out from the terms in here? Anything? Yes?
So I noticed that you have the 13th Amendment and the 15th Amendment. Well,
Yeah.
the 14th Amendment will be tested.
I'll put it on there for you. I'll go ahead and add the 14th. What was the 13th Amendment?
That's no slavery, right?
13th
No more
Amendment
slaves.
ended slavery. That is on here for sure. The 15th Amendment dealt with what?
Voting.
Former male slaves' right to vote, basically.
15th Amendment dealt with, what was the language of the 15th Amendment?
Right, citizens to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the U.S. or any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of service.
And what's the significance? Because every single class we went over and I asked y'all, write me an amendment that would give the freedmen the right to vote. And then I asked y'all, okay, and then I compared it to the actual 15th Amendment and asked y'all what the difference was. What was the trick? Go ahead.
This one told you that they're not going to do it, while what we did in class, what we made up was like, we gave it to them, while the 15th Amendment just said like, oh, we're not going to stop you from voting.
Yeah, it's one thing to give a positive affirmation, to specifically give the right to vote. But what the 15th Amendment, it didn't give the right to vote, but it gave reasons that you couldn't deny somebody the right to vote. Race, color, previous condition of servitude, as Angel had said. But the opening there is that would seem to suggest that you could deny the right to vote for other reasons. And that's where the tests come in. Do y'all remember the tests?
The bubble test.
Yeah. The,
Soap bubble test. What was the soap bubble test, Giovanni?
How many bubbles are in a soap or something like that?
Yeah, and I believe in one of the classes it was Sergio that said the number of bubbles in a bar of soap is dependent upon how vigorously you scrub, which was a weird thing to say in the middle of class. But some of y'all were in Sergio's class when he said it. Understand on this. What was the problem, or what was the trick, or what was kind of the irony of the soap bubble test? Go ahead.
Well, it was basically
Zoom in on it.
Whichever answer they wanted, that's the answer they would take. So for someone they didn't want to vote, well, no matter what answer they gave, they'd just be like, that's wrong, because it's not really this. How many bubbles are in a bar of soap isn't really something that you could prove.
The
and be
people that
exact.
were actually administering the test didn't know the answer themselves. And that's kind of the trick on this. If they wanted you to vote, almost anything you said would be right. And if they didn't, it wouldn't. But remember, if they denied you because you didn't know how many bubbles were in a bar of soap, it had nothing to do with race, color, or previous condition of servitude. You get what I'm saying? So the basic idea on this is, okay, that means it's legal. Whereas if y'all wrote me an amendment that said the newly freedmen have the right to vote, it wouldn't matter what test they gave. Ultimately, then you wouldn't, it wouldn't worry. You've got the right to vote. They can't take it away. So that was the trick. And soap bubble test is a good one. Can you give me any others? What's that? What was the grandfather clause? Anybody, if you want it, go ahead. If anybody else.
If your grandfather was allowed to vote, then you can vote.
If your grandfather was allowed to vote, and typically they would put a date on this. So if your grandfather was allowed to vote basically before slavery became illegal, then you would be allowed to vote. Now the trick on this is that obviously there would be a lot of slaves whose grandfathers would not have been allowed to vote. A lot of freedmen, maybe I should say, whose grandfathers would not have been allowed to vote. So now they wouldn't have been allowed to vote. However, there would have been a lot of whites who were poor whites whose grandfathers would not have been allowed to vote. So it wasn't just race, color, or previous condition of servitude, because they were denying both of the races. Grandfather clause, soap bubble test, what else?
The literacy test.
The literacy test. What were the literacy tests?
Like reading tests or like asking questions about like state government or local government.
And do you remember the scene from Selma, what he was asking her?
He asked her how many. First, he asked how many judges were in like that state, and then asked to name all of them.
Yeah, and there were 67 judges. Even before that, he asked her to recite the preamble of the United States Constitution. A literacy test could be they're going to give you a passage of something, and you have to interpret it, be able to read it, be able to explain it. And a lot of poor whites, and obviously freedmen, would not have been educated to be able to read that. Then, as it progressed, they would ask other questions like dealing with government. So maybe it was the number of judges. If you remember, there were a number of questions that I gave you, which would be really impressive to know. A number of those questions that I gave you in that video. You would have to answer these things. And in the Selma scene with Oprah being the person that was applying, not really Oprah, but she was playing the character, understand, they kept asking questions until you missed it. So maybe she'd get a little bit further each time, but the fact was that ultimately they were trying to specifically deny her. If you got it right once, they would oftentimes let you go if they wanted you to vote. And these are talking about the poll workers. Literacy test, grandfather clause, soap bubble test, jelly bean test kind of overlaps with soap bubble. Keep that one in mind. Do you remember any others?
Poll tax.
What was the poll tax?
Charging them.
Them!
Charging them a fee to vote, and then usually having to present that receipt.
Yeah, they were gonna ask you to pay a tax literally to vote, which might be, you know, somewhere between $1 and $5, which depending upon where you were at that time and where you are now, could be the equivalent of maybe $15, $20, $25 today. So kind of keep that thought in mind. If you had to pay $20 to vote, I might not vote. You know, I mean, I could see where somebody 150 or some odd years ago would probably not do the same. Trick on this, if you go back and you look, is that oftentimes many of these people couldn't pay, so they would be eliminated. Many of these people would miss the deadline that they had to pay by, because you think about elections right before the election, not months before. Or if they met the deadline and they were able to pay, they would have to be able to maintain proof of documentation, which means they may very well have lost the receipt by the time election day came around and they wouldn't be allowed to vote. So the poll tax worked in a number of different ways, but you get the idea. Now Jimmy's original question, and this is going around my elbow to get to someplace else, was about the 14th Amendment. What do y'all remember about the 14th Amendment?
Specific.
What about citizenship?
If you were born in the US or otherwise in the US, you were a US citizen.
Wasn't just the U.S., But basically this time now it was saying that the federal government could deal if state governments were to violate certain rights. Equal protection of the law, privileges and immunities. And I had read this piece out. So keep that in mind. If you remember, at the beginning of the country, the state governments held the power, the federal government was down low. Well, about the end of the Civil War, this began to even out, and the 14th Amendment was a big piece of allowing the federal government to rein in state government abuses. But the other piece on this, which was a little bit vindictive, was they said basically if you were somebody that had held elected office and then left and joined the Confederacy, and in fact maybe even held elected office in the Confederacy, you could not come back. You could not come back and serve in the United States government. They weren't going to allow that. I mean, effectively, they were saying, you were treasonous before. We do not want that traitor in you coming back and creating some mayhem, especially after we had just fought a war. So there were a couple of pieces to that.
Unless Congress says.
And they left an out so that they could make some changes to that. You're absolutely right. But I'll add the 14th Amendment. I'll call that the Jimmy Amendment. Okay, what else have y'all got up here? Anything else that jumps out?
Sexual harassment.
Sexual harassment. I think we've talked around this. And in this chapter, we've been talking about group identifications. And the thing that I've tried to stress to y'all as we've gone through this is, I might be a leader, and it's not what I think is okay. It's not what a majority of the room thinks is okay. But it's kind of like what each individual person thinks is okay. So whether it's like sexual harassment, or maybe it's something that's inappropriate, maybe it's something that's potentially racist, whatever the case might be, the trick is not what I think, what you think, what a majority thinks, but it's what each individual person thinks. So if I'm dealing with Nicole, and I'm a good Nicole, and I'm dealing with Joseph, and I'm dealing with Michael, and they're all comfortable, but man, Giovanni doesn't take the same thing the same way. It's not that I was right with what I was trying, or we outvote Giovanni, but it's the idea that I kind of need to be thinking in terms of what Giovanni thinks. Again, about harassment, about gender issues, about racial issues, about religion, about any kind of group identity issue. And that's where people get a little bit frustrated sometimes. Anything else jump out from up here?
What's ADA? Americans with Disabilities Act.
Yeah, ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act. I read a quote from that, and it was a quickie, but I did have a couple of stories. Do y'all remember anything about the ADA?
The guy who kept coming to your stores and knocking stuff down.
That bastard. Yeah, I will never forget that guy that came in. And if you remember, in all of the classes, I sat down in a chair, and there was a guy in Pittsburgh that would come in that wheelchair, and he would sit down and he would measure the aisles. Do you remember what the minimum aisle width is?
3 feet.
3 feet. The minimum aisle width is 3 feet, and if you're in violation of that, you're actually breaking federal law. And every time he came in my store and broke things, we couldn't do anything because technically he was demonstrating that we were violating the law. We could be sued or held liable for this. So kind of keep that in mind. And it makes mention in there, we talked about the grab bars in the restrooms, we talked about the ramps, we talked about the testing center, different things like this. All of these would be examples of things that changed because of ADA, because people with disabilities would be another group that historically had been denied equal treatment. And remember, historically disadvantaged is one of the original terms in that civil rights definition. What else have y'all got up here? And by the way, what is civil rights?
Civil rights is like the idea that everyone deserves to be treated equally under the law.
Everybody should be treated equally under the law regardless of their group identity, and oftentimes historically disadvantaged groups, like it said at the beginning of the chapter, are groups that we should probably pay the most attention to.
What was Plessy versus Ferguson
specifically?
Oh wow,
what was Plessy versus Ferguson? Go ahead.
Wasn't like he was like 1/8 black, but he got a ticket saying he was gonna go to the white train, but then he sat into the black train.
That's right.
The other way around. Other way around. So he sat into the white train.
That's right.
And then they caught him and he said, well, trains shouldn't be segregated. And then Nicole said, no, separate but equal.
Yeah, Homer Plessy was the man. And legally, for whatever reason, and I honestly do not know the reason why on this, but basically, if you were as little as 1/8 black, then you would be considered black by law. So if he was 1/8 black, Homer Plessy was 7/8 white. He was a very light-skinned black man, and you wouldn't